So welcome to it's the third virtual Pen on Fire speaker series in Salon. And Josh has been with us. You were down here in Corona del Mar a few years ago with Sirens, I think. And before that with All This Life.
I think so. God, my memory's terrible. I mean, a memoirist probably shouldn't say that on something being recorded.
Well, let me introduce you then. Josh is the author of the memoirs Model Citizen, which he's here to talk about tonight, and Sirens, as well as 5 novels, including Damascus, which the New York Times called Beat Poet Cool. He's also written Flight Song and Some Things That Meant the World to Me, one of O Magazine's top 10 reads of 2009, and a San Francisco Chronicle bestseller, as well as Termite Parade, an editor's choice in the New York Times. His novel, All This Life, won the Northern California Book Award, and he's founder of Decant Editorial. So he's here tonight primarily to talk about Model Citizen. And if you'd like to order a signed copy of the book, Finney Books in North Seattle has them. And I'll put the web address. I think I have the web address. I will put it in the chat so you could order and get a signed copy. So Josh, let's start with you talking about how Model Citizen came about.
It's a good question. It's actually really, I would argue, is kind of an inspiring story that ties into Finney Books, which is like, we planned all this, Barbara. I published a memoir about 4 years ago called Sirens, in which I had 3 strokes in my 30s. And then I had this heart surgery where they went into my wall and they went into my heart, excuse me, and they built this wall, which is a super cool thing. And they told me that I was fixed and the story was over. And because they had some white coats on, I chose to believe that story. I've been kind of joking as I've been on tour talking about this book that it reminds me a little bit of Aaron Sorkin's Facebook movie, in that when he chose to make that movie, Facebook meant something different to us culturally as a stopping point. If he had ended the movie during the Trump years, I would imagine that the movie would have had a little bit of a different ending. And that's sort of what happened to me. I had the strokes, they had the surgery, and voila, I was fixed. So I thought the book was over. But the book wasn't over because 2 years after my surgery, I had another stroke. A really serious one this time, where my arm didn't work for a week and it was super no bueno. So I knew that I wanted to write about it. I didn't think I was going to want to leap right into writing another memoir. Cut to this bookstore called Finney Books, where there was a woman in there browsing, and the guy who owns the bookstore put a copy of Sirens in this woman's hand. And this woman happened to be a senior editor at FSG. This woman's name was Daphne. She's super cool. And Daphne actually contacted me, full circle, via Facebook. And she sent me this little note that said, I don't care what your next book is. I love Sirens and I just want to do your next thing, whatever it is. So the first thing that went through my mind, obviously, was, which one of my friends is mean enough to play this trick on me? Or is it a Russian bot? Or this is too good to be true, right? Like, people at FSG don't just like knock on our doors. But that's what happened. And then she came to town and we went out to lunch, and she asked me point blank, you already wrote a memoir. Is there more of the story? And so I told her what I've been telling you, that they told me that I was fixed. And I wasn't. And that really spoke, I thought, had an interesting conversation with my history of being an addict, where people want to believe that an addiction is this binary thing, right? Like, you're dirty, you're messed up, and you get clean, and everything's fine now. And that's not true. So I never thought about Model Citizen as an addiction memoir. I think about it as a relapse memoir. And that might, to you, that might sound like, as though I'm splitting hairs. But I think it's a really important distinction to say that we're not focusing on, you know, the addiction side of the story. What we're focusing on is like the day-to-day status quo, keep your stuff together. You know, like I got a kid, I got a wife, I'd like to not ruin my life again. It seems like that should be pretty easy, right? Like your life is good, let's keep it good. And maybe that's simple for other people, but that's not simple for me at all. So that was sort of the genesis of the story. And then the second question Daphne asked me, and this tethers into the little, Barbara asked me to read a very brief excerpt for you this evening, tethers into the what I was going to read tonight, when she said, well, is there other stuff from your history that you could tell us? And I just got a big old shit-eating grin on my face and said to her, I've done so many dumb things, we could write 10 memoirs together. And that is certainly true. So I was thinking I might read you just 2 pages, just to kind of give you a flavor of how I'm putting these things together, and then we can have a more robust conversation. I would imagine there's a bunch of writers here too, so we can kind of talk about memoir strategies and ethics and kind of my thoughts about how a memoir should sound and how we should approach writing memoir. 2 things I want to say about, you know, my preferences as I was putting the book together too. I'm a big believer that people's memoirs should sound like they talk. I think the best memoirs should sound as though the writer herself is sitting on the bar stool next to you, and she's whispering her dirty laundry in your ear. It has to feel that intimate. It has to feel that visceral. And if she's not on the bar stool next to you, she's on 2 bar stools away or 3 bar stools away, and you can't quite hear the story. What? What'd you say? What year? Who was there? Huh? So our job in the revision process is to slowly close the proximity, so she's as close to us as she possibly can be. I love the writer Charlie Baxter, and Charlie has the best definition of the word visceral that I've ever heard, and it was something I thought a lot about when I was putting Model Citizen together. And he defines the word visceral like you're sitting in the front row of a playhouse, and the actors are so into the production that their spit is hitting you in the face. That's obviously a pre-COVID metaphor. We can all agree on that. But I think the lesson is bulletproof from the standpoint of, like, you know, our audience is probably in the second mezzanine in the first draft. And then she's in the first mezzanine, and then she's in row 20. And slowly but surely, we want to get her to that front row where she has that visceral thing that Flannery O'Connor used to call experienced meaning. She's right in the front row. She's right on the bar stool next to us, and we're in this together, inciting that really fun complicity, inviting her into the action as close as we can. So now that I've said all that, you can hear 2 pages and be like, what's this guy talking about? He didn't do any of those things. Oh, right. Let's see here. Seeing as how me and you are grafting and growing together, diluting our senses, my heart becoming yours, my mind seducing your set of perceptions, holding them, well, not hostage exactly, as that makes it sound sort of adversarial. And we are the furthest things from enemies. On the contrary, we are slowly becoming each other, which makes the whole hostage idea goddamn ridiculous. You can't hold yourself hostage. That's impossible. Leave us alone. We are just 2 consenting adults dissolving any boundaries between us, between our brains, watching them form a new murky world, wasabi melting in soy sauce, you dissolving into me, us, a whole new vibrant animal. And so if I told you about the motorcycle assisted suicide, you wouldn't hold that against me, right? That's 1 sentence. No way. You couldn't hold that against me. You couldn't because you're me. because we're the same, and you can't schadenfreude yourself. But before we had this melting moment, before we came together to share this beautiful and terrifying thing called community, I was coming out of a blackout in Tahoe. Now, did my binge start in Tahoe? No, it did not. Did I have any idea how I got to Tahoe? Not so much. Coming out of a blackout while you're conscious is, well, disconcerting. That's the nicest way to put it. Normally, I'd black out and come to the next morning in my bed or someone else's. The first thing I always did, run my index finger over my front teeth, making sure I still had all my chompers. In Tahoe, I came out of the blackout sitting at a bar. This wasn't the first time it had happened to me by any stretch, and I'd like to think I handled it like a trained professional. Leaning over to the guy next to me and saying, "Excuse me, kind sir, can you please tell me where I might currently be located on this marvelous planet that we call home?" I doubt that, though. I remember needing to throw up. Remember seeing everyone's snow hats and snow jackets, and that the bar was scattered with everyone's gloves, which looked like dead bats lying there. I remember thinking, now that's strange. People in San Francisco wearing winter gear. Are we in some sort of cold snap? The urge to throw up cranked to desperate wretches, so I ran out of the bar's front door into a snowstorm and puked a fine puddle, landing like a Rorschach blot on the parking lot's white powder. The roads were empty, the whistle of wind the only noise. I peeked at the bar and its warmth, then up at the sign. That was how I solved one of the looming mysteries. The sign said something about being the place for Tahoe's locals. It must have been a fairly impromptu decision to roll from SF to the mountains because I wasn't dressed for the weather. I had on jeans and a hoodie, stood shivering next to the Rorschach puke, watching the snow fall on the near empty parking lots. And that was when I saw him drive out of the snowstorm. Actually, I heard his gruff engine first, then spotted the arc of white light in the distance, halos of wonder playing on the falling snow. His headlight felt like a search party coming to find me. Finally, I made out the motorcycle emerging from the snow. He was obviously some snow mirage, something from my shame brain, bringing this motorcycle man to lift me up and carry me away, to exorcise all these galloping demons. He was a priest. I could tell he could shuck my poison. I hoped he would pass by close so I could feel his tenderness and love. Hoped he might shout some wise words as he sped by. Life seems sadistic, brother, he might say. But happiness can swerve in at strange times, just like my headlight slicing through this snowfall. Thank you, I'd say. I'm lost. You were chosen, specifically chosen for this life, he'd scream, and I hear every word as though his mouth was inches from my ear, despite the speed and snarl of his machine. He'd say, you were one sperm racing toward an egg, competing with millions of your brothers and sisters for this world. And here you are, and aren't we all rancid miracles? Thanks.
Thank you, Josh. So kind of along the lines of what you said before you read in terms of memoirs should sound like the writer talking. You also said there was an LA Times piece by Tobias Carroll on you, and you said you thought nonfiction depends more on authentic voice than professional gloss. Can you say
I
more?
said that?
You said that.
It's funny because that profile was so flattering. I only read like the first 6 sentences and my palms got sweaty and then I had to shut it down.
It was very nice. Very
But
nice.
I agree with whomever said that. If I did say that, I like that. And I think it's important for us to say that, you know, memoirs, I'm very skeptical of memoirs where at the end, someone presents themselves on some sort of superimposed perch of wisdom, right? That they've like learned so much during their time here. That always rings hollow to me. I like memoirs that look me in the eye the whole time. They acknowledge at the beginning that they're a confused animal and I'm a confused animal too. We're going to share some time, and by the end, we're still confused animals, but maybe like we were able to share a moment of human empathy. Um, I also think that memoirists should think about the life that the artifact is reflecting. And what I mean by that is I left mistakes in this, mistakes that I would have fixed if it was a novel. And what I mean by mistakes is you have to make an intentional decision as a memoirist to say, if we're all looking for that symbiosis or that wonderful kiss between form and content, we want the artifact to sound like it's replicating the life that it's talking about. And I've lived a very punk rock life, and I wanted this book to sound like a Bad Brains song. Now, it doesn't matter if you know who Bad Brains is or not. I'll just tell you all you need to know about them. The drummer was probably on cocaine, so he's speeding up and slowing down, right? The guitar's out of tune. It's the third week of the tour, and the singer's voice is a little hoarse. They still are playing the songs, but there are these mistakes, or what I would call kind of like character bubbles. So I left some edges that I would have typically sanded down because I wanted this to be more of a reflection of who I was during my time here. You know, and especially I put a little bit more, probably an onus on that because I wrote this as a love letter to my daughter. You know, when I had my fourth stroke post the surgery, that was when a cardiologist or a neurologist who was not very gifted in the bedside manner department told me that I'm not going to live out of my 40s. So, you know, they're wrong all the time. And I know that too. I'm not saying that in a poor me way. I'm just saying that like I took that as velocity or as energy that I wanted to funnel right into the book, because if I do not live out of my 40s, and my daughter's only 7 as we speak right now, I not only want her to learn some things about me, but I also want her to learn about how I sound, my cadence. Like we all have a time signature with how we talk. And I feel like memoirists want to kind of lock into whatever their particular organic cadence is on page 1 and try to ride that all the way until page the end if we can pull that off. It's harder than it sounds though.
Well, you know, I was curious because you have 5 novels before Sirens, and this is the second memoir. So had you ever considered doing this story, doing Sirens as, and then this as a novel?
Well, I think probably, you know, I mean, nobody would do this, but if there's ever like a really like lonely PhD candidate out there and like they wanted to look at the if there was a Venn diagram between my nonfiction work and especially my first novel, like I've been circling this stable of preoccupations for my entire career. And you know, perhaps all artists are doing that. I mean, David Lynch keeps making the same movie. I just like that movie, so I go to see it, right? Like the Rolling Stones have written that song 85 times. Like it's a pretty good song, right? So like we let them get away with that. You know, aesthetically and stylistically, there are motifs that I keep revisiting. I'm fascinated by the idea about the people who say they love you that don't treat you in that manner. these codes, these familial codes, these affinities that we try to, nurture and cultivate over the years, how they're corrupted, when they're corrupted. So these are things that I'm constantly revisiting just from a multitude of different vantage points.
Speaking of cadence, Caitlin is curious about that. And do you speak your writing out loud?
I almost edit my nonfiction exclusively out loud. So for a novel, I would probably do the last 2 or 3 drafts out loud. Like even when I'm writing in a fictional mode, time signature is important to me. I'm a failed musician, so I'm always thinking in terms of time signature. But with nonfiction too, I always think about style, right? Especially with nonfiction, because it's rarely about the what. Like we've heard every story that a memoirist could possibly tell, we've heard before. So I'm much more interested in the how it's being told on the line level, but more important for me than that is to really, really think about how you're curating. Like, obviously, we all know our system of life experience. We have got access to what has happened to us during our time here. So it's not a dilemma for the memoirist to say what's going to go in the story. Typically, the anxiety comes in terms of like, well, how do I organize it? Reality is this formless thing. How am I supposed to actually make some sort of through line or some sort of cogent narrative arc that the reader is going to have the opportunity to plug in and play? So I'm asking those kind of macro questions, but Caitlin, I must have read this book. I mean, I'm a compulsive person anyways, but I must have read this book out loud 100 times. I mean, my poor wife, geez. It's like in the basement muttering to myself for 6 months. And in fact, Barbara mentioned my last novel, which was called All This Life. At the time, we lived above a laundromat in San Francisco, and our kid was just about a week old when Counterpoint called me, and they were like, "Man, we're going to sue you. We need our money back. Or you have to give us a book." So what I decided was, if I did the laundry every day, I had 20 minutes when it was in the washing machine and 40 minutes when it was in the dryer. So I actually wrote the rough draft of that in the laundromat. And I would just be in the corner with my iPhone, just being like, and like all the people in the laundromat doing their stuff in the morning were like, "Oh, that poor guy's off his meds again. Oh." But I'm a big advocate of interacting with your work in as many mediums as you can. Like from a neuroscience standpoint, you read different on an analog page than you do on a digital page. I'm then reading it out loud. I'm probably also going to record it. So then when I'm running or doing whatever, I can be listening back to it and catching those things as well. Anything that I can do to make the work seem pristine, so it can seem surprising, even if I've interacted with it so many times that I know how the sausage is made, we still have to kind of trick ourselves, which is why it can be advantageous between drafts to even do something as simple as changing your font and your margins, just so the work looks different. Like if it's been in Courier, right, and you put it into Garamond, suddenly your eye can't be on autopilot anymore, because everything's going to look different on the line level.
So what is the carryover from fiction to memoir? Is there carryover?
I pretty much feel like it's the same thing. All the tricks I use in my novelist toolkit, I use in memoir construction. I'm actually very happy that I had a bunch of novels under my belt first, because it really helped me with structure. I think structurally, I probably would have just defaulted to linearity, causality, kind of rule in the roost. But if you read Model Citizen, the connections between scenes and chapters are more associative than linear driven. Like we're popping all over in space-time. Like we're always returning to kind of a recognizable through line so the reader can put her feet on the ground. But while, I orient you here, then all of a sudden, it's 1985, it's 2011, it's 2017. So if I've done my job right, you're never going to be confused. You're never going to be obfuscated. But we're going to approach time in kind of the way the human mind works. It's not logical how we're always bandying from this to this. I mean, sometimes there are these direct triggers, but sometimes there are these and subconscious connections that we're not even aware of, or certainly wouldn't be able to articulate. So you kind of do your best on the page to kind of modify how your human heart and your brain processes the world around you. And I'm not a linear thinker at all. So I wanted to kind of to play to that strength, if it is a strength, in the memoir.
How do you keep track? Do you have, Post-its or butcher paper on the wall? How are you keeping track of the different threads?
Yeah, I do usually have in one wall of my office, I've got like the Freytag's pyramid, that kind of that upside down check mark that we see. And I'm a very tactile learner. I know you can do all this stuff digitally with Scrivener and all that jazz, but I like to do it with 3x5 cards with my hands, red, blue, and black, because I'm color coding certain riffs in the story. It makes me feel like I'm more in like a laboratory. I don't know, it's not true, but it makes me feel like I'm like the art's in the room with me. When if I do it on the computer, sometimes it feels a little too far away. And again, like I talked about, trying to cultivate and nurture that intimacy with the audience. But I would also say that the writer herself has to do that as well. We ask that question all the time with our characters: what's at stake? But the same question has to also apply to the memoirist. What's at stake for you with the story that you're telling? Or maybe a better way to phrase it: if you're not writing about the things you don't want to write about, you ain't doing your job right.
Well, along those lines too, I was thinking about the best memoirs seem to be written by people who have little or nothing to fear in terms of, what others are going to think, what they're going to feel about you once they read this. And it seems like in this book, you're so honest. And so as I was reading different sections, I was thinking, did you ever worry about anyone reading this? With first drafts, we throw everything on the page, hopefully, and worry
Right.
about it later. But was there ever a point with anything in the book that you worried about what was in what you were leaving in the book and not taking out?
Well, I think two things stick out to me. First, I taught nonfiction before I had written a memoir, which they probably shouldn't have let me do that. I don't, maybe nobody should teach in genres that they haven't published in. So when I sat down to write Sirens, I wrote the first draft of Sirens in this 2-month waiting period. So I had my third stroke on January 1st, 2015. And my surgery was scheduled for March 11th of that year. And my neurovascular surgeon goes, "You only have one thing to do: stay alive." And I was like, "This is so scary. Why would you say that?" And I'm a writer, so I make sense of things by writing them down. And I've always talked to students, even before I had written anything nonfiction, about the first draft of a memoir should be what I call a danger draft. Because what I hear from people when I teach is, what about if my sister reads this? What about if my parents read this? What if my son reads it? And I'm certainly not saying don't think about those people. Of course, we should be ethical with how we're manicuring and doting on these artifacts. I'm just saying, if you invite those voices in too soon, it will impede your capacity to do your job the way that you need to do your job. So the first draft is a danger draft, and it's the warts and all truth. It's the worst of you on the page. nobody's going to read it except for you. So you don't pull a punch, you don't pander, you don't over explicate. It's the warts in all you. So I think if you abide by that philosophy, it allows you to feel liberated or not kind of encumbered by these fantasies, these voices that we pretend that we know what people are going to think, but we don't really know what they're going to think. So when I got through this 2-month window, when I'd written my danger draft, I really thought I was going to die on the operating table. Like that's totally how my life works. Like things are just about to get better, and then that's it. So when I survived the surgery, spoiler alert, did I just ruin the book for everybody? Oh, I'm sorry I did that. So when I survived, my mantra was, don't get careful now. Like you wrote the book. Don't get careful, but also do it ethically. So, I told my wife, my current wife, I said, I'll read this. Anything you want me to take out, I will take out. I only give veto power to a select few, because if you give veto power too widely and people tell you to take stuff out, then you have to take stuff out. The other subdivision was people that I was gonna tell them it was coming out, but I wasn't gonna give them veto power, like my ex-wife. She still lives in San Francisco. I didn't want her to read a Chronicle review. I wanted her to know. So I took her out to dinner, looked her in the eyeballs, and told her the truth. And she said, and I'll never forget this, sure, I'm not going to read it anyways. Which is like the best answer, right? Because as a memoirist, we're always like all up in our narcissism and the feels. And she was just like, I don't care. Do what you want. So in a sense, I kind of had this like wonderful education, right? I had this gift where I thought I was going to die. So I just told the warts and all truth. And I was so proud with the way that Sirens turned out. When FSG came calling and they told me that they wanted to buy Sirens from $2 Radio and that Sirens was going to be parts 1 and 2 of this, and then the new stuff was going to be parts 3 and 4, it gave me a map, because usually what takes me a long time to write a book is the style and the aesthetic in terms of how I want to disseminate content to the reader. I already knew how I was going to do that because I wanted to kind of follow the template of Sirens. So again, it was just this idea that I want to kind of dive in feet first and kind of continue this punk rock song that I've just had a blast putting together over the last few years.
Well, I was going to ask you in terms of that, FSG says, okay, we want you to do more. What happened next? Did you do a synopsis or some sort of outline, or how did you kind of come to what it would be?
I think to Daphne's credit, because she, probably she would have done it differently if she hadn't responded so positively to Sirens.
Mm-hmm.
But she really just told me, like, go do your thing. Like, if you need any help, like, shoot a flare up in the sky, but otherwise, like, let me know when the book is done. Mm-hmm. So I had about 18 months where I pounded out, I'd say, the first couple drafts, send it to her to kind of like get a temperature in terms of what she was positively responding to and what she wasn't responding to and the stuff that she didn't understand. What I've found over the years is that editors are typically always right that there are problems when they say there are problems, but their solutions are usually always incorrect. So whenever she tells me like something's wrong in chapter 7, the things that she would pitch to me in terms of solution were probably never the play, but she's always right that those are the areas that are going to need some further artistic attention to function at a more optimal level. So she really left me alone. But also to her credit, like if I had needed more help, I mean, she would have been as involved as I would have needed her to be during the genesis of this artifact.
So then did you just go for it? I mean, did you just every day when you sat down to write, did you write whatever wanted to come out, or did you go, okay, I have to do this section, I have to do this, because you have all these different threads going on in the book.
I think they might seem like, from your seat, they might seem like different threads. I'm not sure that they seem like different threads from my seat. Mm-hmm. From my seat, if I thought about it in terms of an astronomer, like Let's pretend like this fist is a planet, right? And so in a planetary system, we need the planet first because it's going to supply the gravity. And once we've got the gravity, that's when all like the cool moons are allowed to satellite and do like the cool moon stuff. But without something supplying the gravity, everything's just going to be going all over the place. I would argue that most memoirs function the same way, is that we don't want to just have this like 20-year beat by beat story. We want to have a recognizable, short epic in time that the reader can feel that gravitational pull. Like look at Cheryl's Wild, right? Like she takes a long walk, right? Like she takes a long walk, but that if I was to say that to you, like, oh, Cheryl wrote a book about taking a long walk, you'd be like, what the hell are you talking about? Like that's this much of the story, and it is, but it's the entire framing device for the book. Within that long walk, we're in our time machine going to all sorts of cool places with Cheryl. So the only reason I'm mentioning that is in your memoir, in your work in progress, do you yet know what's supplying the gravity?
Mhm.
Like Cheryl could have told the whole thing and it could have culminated in a long walk, but she was smart enough to know that she needed something to be the bones, right? And then from there, then we can do the thing. And I also found that this astronomy metaphor was really helpful in the revision process, because any moon that wasn't speaking directly to the drama and the danger of the planet had to hit the cutting room floor. Because as all of you know, revision's easy at first, right? Like keep the cool stuff and kill the crappy stuff. But eventually you're going to get so deep and so into the elegant part of the revision process where everything is good. And you still have to make those tough determinations. So having some sort of system to evaluate the decisions that you've already made on the book's behalf to make sure that they're the most nutrient rich decisions can be really, really advantageous. So think about it this week. Like, do you know what that planetary body is in your story? And then once you identify that, is it the sort of planet that needs 3 moons, 10 moons, 18 moons? It really just depends on the kind of life that you've led.
Um, when you showed the book to your wife, um, did she ask you to take anything out?
Um,
Or did anybody ask you to take
She
anything
didn't
out?
ask me to take anything out of this one. She asked me to take a scene out of Sirens that I took out. And she's the only person that I gave veto power to.
Mhm.
I did ask my biological mom for the first book. She's clean now too. Like she's got 30 years at this point, like, um, and I was not going to mortgage our relationship for some silly book.
Mhm.
Like we've worked so hard to heal. Like I grew up in fire. And it took a long time for us to repair that relationship. And in fact, if you study my nonfiction, like I mention some things between the ages of 5 and 12, but I don't really go there, and I won't until she's no longer with us,
Mhm.
because I value that relationship much more than I do any sort of silly book.
Mhm. Um, you talk about your father a lot in this book, and it's interesting that he quit the ministry and got a PhD in archaeology. That's kind of fascinating. But what I was curious about as I was reading about him and you is I was wondering how your dad influenced the way you father.
God, no one's ever asked me that before, Barbara. I love that. That's such a cool question.
Yeah.
It's interesting to ponder authorial responsibility with parents when one's alive and one's deceased. Like my father died very young, and my father was um, he really really liked persona. Like he was this like slick, airbrushed, handsome minister. And he liked that. And he'd made some mistakes over his life, and he didn't want anybody to know about those mistakes. We're all sort of products of our environment, however we grew up. And because he died without me ever knowing who he was as a man, that bothers me to no end. It bothers me to no end that he didn't trust me with the truth. And it bothers me to no end that I didn't trust him with the truth, because I was a junkie still. It breaks my heart every day that he never got to see me on the sunny side of the street, or never got to see me with father the way that I father, in this kind of full contact, joyful way. But because he kept the truth from me, it's one of the reasons that I wrote this book. It's one of the reasons I intentionally overcorrected. I'm telling Ava stuff in here that you might read and you think to yourself, man, I went to this salon with this guy and he told me that this was a love letter to his daughter, but there's like felonies in here. Like, does he know what a love letter is? Because I don't think it's supposed to sound like this. But I would argue that that's what makes it a real love letter, is the fact that I'm telling her everything. She might not even want to read the book someday, and that's totally her right. But because I didn't get any truth, I wanted to give her access to a lot more of the truth than she'll ever want to know.
Were there any other readers or people you were writing to? Was there an audience? Was it only Ava that you were kind of writing this letter to, this book to, or do you have in mind when you're writing the ideal reader, the person that you think will get it?
Yeah, I hear people say sometimes that you should never write thinking about an audience or thinking about your audience, and I would agree with that from the standpoint of if the implied audience that you're daydreaming about is limiting you. If you're imagining readers that are bad at their job, like, then don't imagine those readers. Like, I like to believe, and I totally believe this, so don't ruin this for me. I believe that when I have a new book come out, that the first person that buys a copy is Virginia Woolf, right? And she like lurches out of the grave, goes to the nearest independent bookstore and is like, I gotta have it. And then it's Tom Waits, and it's Patti Smith, and it's Sam Shepard. And if I think about those people, man, they're brilliant. They're so good at their job. I can do anything on the page and they're savvy enough to pick it up. So I feel like if you're writing to your ideal audience that's going to bring out the best in both your imagination and your work ethic, that's when we're cooking with gas. But if you're thinking to yourself, and sometimes you hear like cranky writers be like, oh, the desiccating attention span of the 21st century. Your readers are really, really smart. And if you don't write that way, you're going to lose them. So I would make the argument that you have to risk losing the crappy readers to keep the good readers. So whether it's Virginia Woolf and Sam Shepard for you doesn't matter, but maybe make a litany this week. Who would be your 5 target audience members, dead or alive, the people that are going to bring out the best in you, the people that can do anything on the page. There's an apocryphal story about Fred Astaire being asked what it was like to be the best dancer in the world. And Fred Astaire said, how the hell do I know? Ask Ginger Rogers. She does the same thing backwards and wearing heels. And what I love about that is if we think about it from the authorial perspective, we're Fred Astaire. And we have to believe that the audience is Ginger Rogers, and anything that we're going to heave their way, so long as we take the fastidious time to do our job right, she's going to get it. And we're going to have a great time together.
That's great. Okay, so dialogue, there's a lot of dialogue in this book, and I will assume that you did not take notes throughout.
Rigorous notes, Barbara. Yeah.
So talk about writing dialogue in a memoir when you didn't take notes. I mean, are you writing what someone would have said, how they would have said it, what they should have said? How are you doing that?
It's a great question, and I think each scene is going to kind of dictate its own, or its own parameters in terms of how I would approach direct and indirect dialogue. Um, Basically, in my world, I think about dialogue in the sense of like, I know that I was in this room, and I know that some stuff happened, and I know how things ended up. And my job is to be like as emotionally true to that moment as I possibly can be. I stole that phrase "emotionally true" from Mike Consigliore, Jerry Stahl, who probably has dialogue in his memoir, and there's no way he remembers writing it. The thing that I'd always come back to is this one kind of philosophy with memoir writing, is that you can't intentionally lie. And I think that adverb "intentionally" is where the magic is. You're going to lie in a memoir. It's impossible. Memory is so fallible. And they say that actually every time you revisit a memory, you change it just a little bit. So, if this is something that happened to you when you were 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, and you're 70 years old, well, that's going to change the way that you interact with that narrative because you've revisited it. And if you've told it out loud, you tell it out loud, it's not going well, right? And then you tell a joke, and they like that part of the story. So the next time you tell the story, you kind of shortchange the boring stuff and you play up the fun stuff. And, it's just important for memoirists to just acknowledge the fact that we're going to get things wrong, and that's okay. We talk in fictional world about the unreliable narrator. We talk about it in terms of who's reliably supplying the unreliable, because there's no such thing as a reliable narrator in fiction or nonfiction. The thing is, we can't intentionally lie. I did my best to recreate these scenes that I went through. Sometimes there was more talking, sometimes there was less talking, but I felt like we needed to hold some hands to make sure that we were all kind of oriented in terms of what's happening in a certain scene. But yeah, I think any line of dialogue, unless you've recorded something, is going to be some sort of approximation to the truth. As long as you're not trying to intentionally deceive your audience, in my world, you're in bounds as a memoirist.
Yeah, interesting. Well, what do you think about certain memoirists won't put their dialogue and close it within quotation marks? Because
say that again, sorry.
Memoirists will not put their dialogue in quotation.
I've never seen that before. You mean like how Beckett used to just set it off with like a single dash, or
just, yeah, because they don't know that somebody said that.
Right.
They didn't necessarily say that. And
well, another tool that we have at our disposal, and I do it all the time in Sirens, is in Model Citizen, I just tell the reader, like, I'm making this part up. Like there's a whole conversation I have, like when I have a bubble test about 6 weeks after my surgery, and it shows that I'm not healing the right way. They told me that the bubbles weren't clinically significant. I was like, to you, they're not clinically significant, but we're talking about, I've had 4 strokes. What are you talking about? This isn't clinically significant. So then I have this whole conversation with these 2 doctors that never happened. And I just tell the audience that this is a superimposition. This is me pretending that this happened. And in fact, there's all these speculative elements in Model Citizen. There's surrealism. There's a talking dog. There's a talking duffel bag. There's a talking Nazi doctor. There's a talking Subaru Outback. Those things can't happen. So how can that be in a memoir? They're all just externalizations of things that I was talking to myself about. So why would I just render it in boring interiority if I have other options at my disposal? Like memoir in 2021 is so hip and so cool. We can do so many things right now, as long as, again, we're just being honest about it. And I just tell, and this is a flight of fancy. I'm going to tell you something else. I'm going to tell you something else. The guy that developed the surgery that I did, In the 1920s, he was this German kid. He was in his 20s, and he posited that he could run a catheter into the human heart. And nobody would give him any money to do it. And like a perfect German, he said, I'll do it to myself then. Fine. And he cut himself on the elbow crease and ran a urinary catheter into his heart, and then had to walk down 3 flights of stairs to the X-ray machine so they could take pictures of it.
Mm.
And we can all agree that in that one shining moment, he did this amazing thing. He changed the world. That's a good thing he did. And then in 10 years, when World War II starts, he's patching up Nazi soldiers on the Russian front. Oops. So is that a good life or a bad life? And he became a perfect vehicle for me to talk about being an addict. You know, all these things, all these decisions I made, these ignominious things I said or didn't say, things I did or didn't do. And now I try to like drive the kids to soccer practice, but it's always both of those things. So these conversations that I'm having with this Nazi doctor, I would argue I'm not making them up. They're an externalization of all the anxiety that I was feeling leading up to the surgery. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense. I like the freedom you talk about in terms of writing memoir, you know, the freedom that memoir should have.
Well, you know, there's so many, you know, I guess it makes sense that, you know, with your first draft or two, like what's allowed, what's not allowed. I would say, like, again, in terms of the danger draft, try to bolster all of those questions. You'll get to them. There's time for those questions. But during draft 1, like, you need to have that gust of creative enthusiasm, right? Like, you should be this improvising musician, just making stuff up, having a blast. Then in the revision process, you take off that improvising musician's lens and you come back with kind of the fastidious organization of like a tax accountant, right? And then you kind of weigh the pros and cons of the decisions that you've already made. But if you try to do that too soon, it's going to choke you up. You're not going to feel free. You're not going to be able to do the work that you need to do. So I try to stay in a flow state as much as I possibly can and not to have my conscious mind on it all when I'm drafting. So like, you know, I'm a nocturnal writer, so I work from like midnight until about 5. I have like headphones on, music's going crazy, I'm swigging espresso. And when I'm not advocating for this at all. And when I write, I don't have any lights on in the house except for the work. I want the only thing throwing illumination to be the work itself. And I love the middle of the night because there's no text, there's no emails, no one's bugging me. I try to get all of the societal stuff away as I possibly can so it can just be me and the work, me and the work, me and the work.
If anybody has any questions that you want to ask Josh directly, you can take yourself off mute. And
there's a lot of power, guys. Don't drop the ball here.
Okay.
When do you sleep?
I sleep in the morning sometimes. Like I'll get up to do like the kiddo breakfast stuff. I have an espresso machine, so it's not that big of a deal. And then I'll kind of conk out in the morning, get a few hours of sleep. I'm just lucky in the sense that like I don't need a lot of sleep. I can function on 3 or 4 hours and I'm A-okay. Like I popped out of bed this morning at 4. I feel fine.
Marilla.
Yes, hi Josh. I admire the way that you are able to like you have this front timeline of a few months, I think. But then you're able to bring in so many different parts of your life, and somehow it works.
Hopefully, you have to tell me, Morella.
It does, because I was with you through the whole book, and you mentioned that your guide is a kind of association, but I'm just trying to hack it. I have so much from different times of my life that I want to bring in, and I've had a really hard time with structure and container. So
And I would also say one of the things that we should probably do as memoirists is to just be honest and say to ourselves, structure is probably going to be the last thing to reveal itself to us. I know lots of memoirists, and rarely do we know how we're going to structure these things until the last minute. I mean, in fact, I'm not telling a story that she wouldn't tell herself. Like the great Lydia Yuknovich talks about this all the time. Like if you've never read her memoir, The Chronology of Water, read that before you read my book because it's better. And then Lydia didn't know how to structure that book. Like she wrote it all down. And then she and her editor at her editor's kitchen table, like sat down and they curated it together, and they found like these really interesting juxtapositions and were able to put these images and tableaus in conversation to kind of incite unforeseen or unpredictable conversation. So I guess, Morella, if you get lucky and you find it earlier, that's cool. But if it doesn't happen, I mean, welcome to the Confused Memoirist Club. Like that's just kind of the gig. Like your job right now is to kind of like be writing everything down in the most kind of kinetic and dynamic way that you can. And then once you've completed that task, then turn your attention to architecture. But trying to do those two seemingly disparate tasks with an element of simultaneity, it almost seems as though we're setting ourselves up to fail that way. In Novelist too, like none of my books have the published versions start the way that I thought that they were going to start. There's a story about E.M. Forster with a critic asking him like what his new book was about. And Forster said, well, how do I know what I think until I see what I say? Like we need to know what the climax is going to be, the denouement, and that ever important closing image. And then once we know what we're trying to set up, most of the novelist's job is reverse engineering. Figuring out like, am I setting things up the right way? Am I scattering the requisite clues in the right places? But how can you possibly know that until you finally figure out what that point of exit's going to be? I'm a big believer in Atwood's philosophy that an ending of a narrative has to seem like an unexpected inevitable. How cool is that phrase? The unexpected inevitable, right? We never see it coming, but when we get to that final culminating image, we gasp. Of course this book has to end this way. Once I know what my unexpected inevitable is going to be. And it's weird for a memoirist to say that because these things already happened to us. Like the way this book ends, my wife and I are basically in a fun house. That's why there are all these weird images of me on the front cover. And once I figured out like, oh my God, this is what's going to shut the book down. Now that I know that, how do I want to present this? And how do I want to make sure that everything's kind of dynamically building as people continue to flip pages? So be nice to yourself, Morella. That's my point. Be nice.
I found that to be totally true, that I thought that my book does end where I wanted to end. Can you hear me? Am I talking?
I do. Yeah. Hey, Coop, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Josh? And you said the ending. And then after I got to the ending, I went, well, the beginning's wrong. I mean, the beginning's right, but the beginning's wrong. And so it's like structure strikes me as being left brain or right brain. I never know which one is the right. I never know.
Neither does structure.
that structure brain is like, for me, it has to come in way later. I mean, for me, it just has to be, I just have to write it.
Right. And I just love, part of it's just, we're writing the book that we want to read. Like everybody says that. And I don't have a problem with that. But I also think we can take it a step further and say, certainly write the book you want to read, but also write the book that only you can write. And so some of that's going to have to do with, obviously, with life experience in a memoir, but just in terms of structure, like, how does your brain work? You know, like, I wanted this book to sound like how my brain's all over the place, and that's okay. There's lots of memoirs that function this way. Anything in 2021 that you want to do, someone's already done it before.
Right.
Like, it's more just a matter of figuring out how to pay homage to the great, how do I want to say this? The great paradox of literature, that you can only say something about humankind via the individual. And the more precise and the more nuanced and idiosyncratic you are about that observation about this one person, if you do that job right, perhaps she or he can stand for something greater than himself, right? We're always trying to connect our story in a memoir to something better, to something bigger. These existential conversations that's been happening since scribbles on cave walls. That's what's so cool. This is our 20 seconds on this planet. And we get to be in charge of the storytelling for just this grand blip. And let's write like our asses are on fire, right? I mean, that's the fun part.
Caitlin had another question.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm all full of questions. Do you think, like, if you don't know the structure until you've written it all, but you know, I assume that you're getting critiques as you're writing it, so that we're not just like writing complete gibberish that no one can understand. How do you kind of handle that when people are giving you feedback?
I know the question that you're asking, but that wasn't in this. I didn't get feedback with this one. Like, I wrote this one in like this weird basement echo chamber. I had one sober pal read it because I needed someone to call bullshit on me when it needed to call bullshit on me. And then just my editor. And then, like, after the book had already been, accepted, that's when my wife's name is Lila. That's when she gave it a read just to make sure that there wasn't anything she wanted me to yank out of it. It's hard to talk about a marriage in progress, right? Like, it's much easier to talk about something that's ended. Like, it's easier for me to talk about my first marriage. It's not a moving target. But how to honor, analyze, but not simplify relationships in progress, I think is one of the hardest things we do as memoirists.
Yeah, agree.
The other thing that I would like to say that this kind of relates to that is this thing about revision. Think about how you're checking for your emotional abstractions. Oftentimes in early nascent passes of memoir construction, there's a lot of like, I was sad, I was frustrated, ooh, I'm feeling lugubrious today. Ooh, can you imagine if somebody had that sentence in their memoir? Ooh, I'm feeling lugubrious today. It's okay that you're doing that in a rough draft. But remember that, like, that's shorthanding emotion, and those things actually don't mean anything anymore. Like, we've devalued those words in such a way that they don't carry any freight anymore. So when you come across them, it's okay that you do it, as long as you're also honing that skill set to catch it and replace it. So you come to, I was feeling frustrated today, and you see it, you feel like a modicum of embarrassment, you realize you're alone in the room, and then you fix it. And your job is to figure out an active image to convey that same sentiment without ever using those words. When Tim O'Brien teaches this, he says you need 32 concrete images for one emotional abstraction. And he's kind of joking, but I think it's an important thing for us to think about as memoirists. It's lazy if we're just relying on these abstractions. That made me so happy. I was so depressed when my marriage fell apart. Okay, am I going to get wet if it's raining? Obviously, these things. Like, how can we do these things where we're conveying the emotional sentiment or the emotional core, but we're relying on active images and scenes to convey those things, rather than just relying on the shorthand of the named emotion? The great Pam Houston says, every time you name something, you limit it. How cool is that? If you name an emotion, you limit that emotion on the page. And we're not trying as memoirists to limit anything. We want to be as emotionally expansive as we possibly can be in the work.
It's good. Anything else? Any other questions? Kirsten, yeah, go ahead.
Kirsten, those flowers behind you are lovely. What are they?
Thank you. Yesterday was my birthday, so they're my birthday flowers.
Birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. And thank you for the stuff that you talked about on the structure, because that's one of the things that keeping me from doing the writing, because I'm doing it backwards, thinking too much about the structure, and it's holding me back. So thank you.
What do you do for a living?
I was a massage therapist.
It's funny too, I'm so interested in people's occupational backgrounds and how that then informs how they're trying to write the book. I wonder too that if there's a way to think about the next thing that you're excited about, you know, because sometimes if we think too much of just about the big picture, we lose the thread of the fun. Like someone told me a long time ago that writing is supposed to be fun. Do you guys believe that? Do you guys believe that someone would actually say something that audacious? And the way that we try to maintain that whimsy or that joy in the revision process is to try to make it as fun as it was during kind of that initial gust. So if you find yourself kind of spinning the wheels in kind of that creative mud, like just think about the scene or the chapter that you're the most excited to write next, even if it's not even related to where you are on this precise moment in the book. Jump to the next thing that you're excited about. Think about it like a film shoot, right? If you and I are making a movie together, and it's going to be a 45-day shoot, and Julianne Mohr is only available for the first 3 days, we're going to shoot all her scenes first. That doesn't mean that that's what the movie's going to look like, but that's what we have to do in order to abide by the particulars of her travel schedule. The things that you're excited about, let's do that this week. And then we'll evaluate next week.
Okay.
But sometimes it takes me a long time to get up the courage to write certain sequences that are going to hurt my feelings, or they're going to make me relive something that I don't want to relive. And if I don't have the wax in my ears and the thick skin to go there, I'll go someplace else. I'll always come back. I'll always do the work, but follow the fun. You know, if you're not having fun right now, like that's what you should be the most seeking after. It's not necessarily like, is this the right structure, but like, how can I enjoy this process? Because we might be able to white knuckle through a draft or two. Like we're dedicated, we're smart people. But if you're not having fun, you're probably not going to finish your book. You know, I know so many people who have abandoned novels and memoirs in drafts 3 or 4 that had the potential to be showstoppers. And it's not that they suddenly got stupid. They just weren't having fun anymore. And it's up to us, because it's going to be different for everybody, to figure out what excites you, where the magic happens for you. What's your version of like listening to the Cramps, drinking 13 shots of espresso with no lights on in the middle of the night? Like that's what works for me. And I'm excited, especially after I do something like this. I'm going to write all night because I'm around other nerds. Right? Like you guys love words the way that I love words, and that matters significantly to me. So I think about these things in a more, how can I imbue more joy in my art? And if we start there, we'll always get to where we want to go.
Okay, that's great. And my question for you was, how did the beginning at the pandemic affect your writing? For some people couldn't get to it at all, couldn't even read. For some, they were able to hunker down and really get to it because of the distractions are gone, or it's too distracting. How did it affect you?
That's a good question. I don't think it wasn't a clean pandemic for me. Like I can't say the pandemic was this. You know, I was in Washington, so I was like right in like Wuhan, Washington last March. And my daughter had a play date with the girl around the corner, and her mom ended up being like patient 12 in the States. So we all got it right away. So that was sort of nice in the sense that we were like immediately, like I wasn't worried about those things. But for the first 6 weeks or so, I don't think I wrote at all because I was so worried that I was going to lose people that I love. I thought at the early stages of the pandemic, I thought like 2 of the 3 of us were going to be dead. And it didn't end up to be that. So by May or June, I was able to start writing again, little bits by little bits. I have a television show that I sold right before the pandemic, so that keeps me busy. I'm always working on at least 4 things at once. I'm a big believer in the hot potato model. So I always try to have something fiction-y, something non-fiction-y, a poem. I'm a closet poet, don't ever tell anybody that. And then also, screenwriting. So that way I never have the excuse of writer's block. I'll be over here having fun for a couple weeks, I'll get stuck, and then I'll pop over here for 6 weeks until I get stuck, and then I'll move over here. So I found the pandemic to be a really fertile time, but I don't know, I think in the New York Times review of Model Citizen, they kept talking about this thing I talk about at the end of the book, cheery nihilism, which is like, ever since I had stroke 4, I feel like I live in this era of cheery nihilism, where it's just like, I see all of this as bonus time. Like, I don't feel like I'm supposed to be here. So like, I kind of see everything through like this toddler lens where I'm just having a blast every day. And it just feels like pure magic. And I don't ever want that feeling to go away. So, I think it was not a lot of it was also coming from my kid. My kid is a big art hound too. So she and I we write a song every day. We write a story every day. We'll paint a picture together every day. So we do something artistic together every single day. That's something that I make sure that we prioritize together. It's a life rich in art, I guess is my point, Kirsten.
Anyone else? Isa?
Yeah, I just thought of what I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. One is, have you read Raymond Carver's Gravy?
I have.
That's exactly what you just described. It's just gravy. So everybody should read that poem. We all understand.
Yep.
But the question I have is, I've read a lot of your books, and I noticed that when you were
Not a competition, everybody, but so far Isa's winning. Go on, proceed.
I've noticed like the voice in the fiction versus Siren. I've not read your latest memoir, but that memoir and the voice were so distinctly different.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying about the characters. I'm just saying that presence of coming through in the book were very different. In fact, if you read, or I read the earlier versus the later, there's a shift. Definitely, Damascus has an incredibly different flavor than Damascus is probably closer to Sirens, I think. But so did you notice that when you were writing something different about what happens when you're doing memoir versus fiction in the way your voice came out? Did you feel something?
I think some of that is going to have to be due with point of view. My first 2 novels were in the first. Damascus was my 3rd novel. It's probably my best novel. And that's when I fell in love with like Dickensian multi-perspective storytelling, where suddenly I was like, oh my God, I can have 8 or 9 or 10 main characters. This is awesome. And I've never written I have the novel coming out in 18 months that's the same way. It's told with 10 points of view. So it requires a different lens of storytelling to have a narrator kind of like popping from consciousness to consciousness. With the memoir stuff, it's just, for me, it's always that I word. It's always about intimacy. Because I feel like the closer I can orient the audience, that's where empathy lives. we might have proven too dumb as a species so far, but I really believe that art can teach us empathy. You know, it forces you to look through somebody else's eyeballs. It forces you to imagine somebody else's system of life experience, and perhaps we can learn more about people that way. God, wouldn't that be nice with the conversations that we have to have right now in 2021? So that's something that's really important to me. Like, I really believe that that this is a Kant show. I really truly believe that if I've done my job right, you can hold this book up to your ear and you can hear my heartbeat. That's why I also believe that books are in hibernation, that books are just these frozen and sap things until a reader is generous enough to bring it to life with her own imagination. Like, we need the readers. So I think if she's going to be generous enough to give me 6 hours, 7 hours of her life while she's reading it, my job, or my side of the transaction, is to take her on this wild kick-ass ride that's unlike anything that she's heard before. And if she does her job and I do my job, we're going to have some fun together.
Did you have anything else, Isa? Did you say you had more than one question?
Well, my one was a gravy, but I just love your work, and I can read. I just already ordered the Finney thing, so I went to.
Oh,
Finney.
cool! Thank
It
you.
is ordered. I love your work, and I love the different textures of it,
I
because
really appreciate that.
it's almost like reading a different author every time I pick up your book. And your books are on my night whatever, the table in the.
Oh my God, you're gonna make me cry. I love hearing that.
I bought a house in this place called Neatarts, right? And I got I got all the furniture here for free. So I put your books, a couple of them up there, and one of them went missing, and I don't know where it went. Somebody stole it. I'm like, so I it's okay. I have a couple of copies, but it's just fun to have you there, and it reminds me of what I aspire to be able to have that flexibility of voice, because I get stuck in my head how I should write something,
Right.
other than what's authentically coming out. And I've been trying memoir lately, and or I don't know if it's memoir, but personal essay, and a different voice is coming out, and I'm like, is this me, or was that me? So I don't know. That's where my question was coming from.
Well, I think, think about how you talk, like, I think really examine kind of your diction and your syntactical combinations as you're kind of orally expressing yourself. And like, how then do you want to honor that on the page? Like, I kind of talk in this weird, like, hipster graduate school slangs, which is like weird hybrid of influences. And so I want the book to sound like how I talk. And when Damascus, I'm trying to do something entirely different. And the new novel, it's my first historical book, which has just been a blast to put together. My agent told me that I wasn't allowed. He goes, and I hate rules, so just guess what way this conversation went. He goes, "You're not allowed to write another bar book." And I was like, "Oh yeah? I'm gonna set it in the Old West. Ha! It's still a bar book, but now they're wearing hats. Who wins, mister?" So again, like, we're always going to revisit like our little stable of preoccupations. I just want the reader, especially this, I'm constantly pointing out to the audience that this is an artifact. I'm constantly pointing out to the artifact that I'm writing this book in the present tense. So every chapter in this book has a riff in the past tense and a riff in the present tense. And hopefully there's this interesting collaboration, or this interesting crosstalk happening between the past tense and the present tense riffs. Again, you want the artifact to reflect the life that you've lived and how you see the world around you. And so intimacy, that was always my buzzword. The other thing I had taped up in my workstation, this is the last thing I'll say about characterization, I had this phrase taped up. It says, "the dignity of complexity." I'm always aiming to not just give my primary characters, but also my tertiary characters the dignity of complexity. That no one's a caricature, that no one's a punchline, that no one's an easy answer. We know that we want complicated characters. How do we do that? Typically we do that by showing them from all these different angles in different social settings. How do they act with a spouse? How do they act with a lover? How do they act with a bully? How do they act with their boss? How do they act with a subordinate? And you see them through all of these various faces on the prism. And if the writer trusts you with a bunch of different angles, then you've got comprehensive access about what it is like to be this person. This another confused animal, to go back to that phrase that I used earlier. We might not all be confused about the same thing, but one of the things that unites us as a species is that we are all confused about something. And I like memoirs that say, come on in, this is my confusion, and we can be in this together.
That's great. Anything else? Anybody have any more questions, thoughts, anything?
Josh, I just wanted to say hello. CJ here.
Oh, hey, Chris, what's up?
Hey, Deb's here too.
I can see her. She looks like a graduate student right now. She's got her glasses on. She's ready to go.
That means she's captivated. It's her captivated look.
I like it. It's good. Well, if anyone is thinking about writing memoir, is dealing with kind of like what we've been talking about tonight in terms of like, shooting the content itself, trying to punt on structure for as long as you can. The other thing that you're going to kind of come up against that I want to just mention is the two versions of you in a memoir. There's at least two of you in a memoir, right? There's the version of you who's actually going through the sequence of events. Like here's the beginning of the book, here's the end of the book. So there's the version of you who's enduring all of that. And then there's a version of you who exists outside the space-time of the book, who's looking back on everything. And that's called the retrospective narrator. The retrospective narrator can be this awesome presence, but it can also really gum up the works. And I just wanted to mention this in terms of like, if you're having problems navigating these two versions of yourself, another philosophy that I found really to be helpful when I was putting Model Citizen together is I never let my retrospective narrator simply corroborate what the reader had just observed and seen. I always use the retrospective narrator to complicate, not corroborate. So the job of the retrospective narrator was to bring in a dissonant note, bring in some tendril of emotional friction that's going to complicate how the reader is trying to metabolize this rather than make it go down easy for them. There could actually be three versions of you if you really want to get like arcane and nerdy about this. Like you can also position your narrator in a different point in time. Like you could, like this came out 2 weeks ago. But the narrator who's telling the story does not live in 2021. This story stops when my daughter is 4 years old. So the narrator doesn't know what has happened the last 4 years. So there's the version of me who's typing, there's the version of me who's narrating, and then there's the version of me who's going through the sequence of events. And I just wanted to mention that because if you're having trouble navigating those at least two versions of yourself, think about that phrase, complicate, not corroborate. I'll use an example from Model Citizen. There's a scene early in the book where I'm driving in a car with one of my mom's old lovers. I'm about 10 years old. And the guy has a cigar in his mouth and he tells me to put my arm down on the armrest. And he puts his arm right next to mine. He takes the cigar and lays it down between our arms so it's burning both of us. And he says, the first one of us to move is soft. And are you tough or not? Obviously I'm a kid and I'm not able to do it. And I pull my arm away once I've been burned enough. Now, if the retrospective narrator comes in and says something dumb like pretend it's Whitney Houston, and you shouldn't burn the kids because the kids are the future. That's so obvious and that's so boring. And that would just be that presence simply corroborating what the reader has already witnessed and seen. But what the retrospective narrator does say is, I liked being with this guy. I really, really, really liked being with this guy because when he told me he was going to pick me up, he fucking showed up. And when he told me we were going to do something, we did it. And did he put beatings on me sometimes? Certainly. But the line that he said, the narrator says to the reader is, if you spend enough time being ignored, a burning cigar on your skin isn't so bad. So that would be an example of the retrospective narrator not corroborating, but complicating that, adding in another element of an emotional level that is unexpected, that is unanticipatable, because it kind of belies the contextual information. So I know that I'm not supposed to be giving a craft lecture, but I'm just a nerd and we're talking about memoir, and I just want to like share as many like secrets and hacks as I possibly can during our little time together.
Great. It's all great stuff. I like that. Well, Goop.
Okay, Josh, what's next?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I have a novel come out in I think about 2 years. FSG is also really slowing me down. They're like, listen, indie kid, we're glad that you think you can publish a book every 18 months, but we're not going to let you do that anymore. So the next book's about it's a novel I started in 2012. It just has taken me forever to get it right. I've never written historically before. It's brutal. I'll never do it again. It's about the first female poker dealer in Gold Rush, San Francisco. This woman came to town in 1852 and was just a badass is badass. And so learning more about her, and then I fictionalized a bunch of stuff, but I drew on a lot of, I was in the Chronicles archives. Like you can still get back to all the stuff that they were doing in the 19th century. Like it's rad to like really do a deep dive into those historical documents. The best piece of advice I got from another San Francisco writer named Janice Newman, who wrote a book about Mary Todd Lincoln. I showed her a couple of pages of what I was doing and she was like, where's the life? Like you write with so much vitality on the line level, it's gone. And she said something that just blew my mind. Maybe you'll think it's obvious, but I hadn't ever thought about it like this. And she goes, Josh, your characters don't know that this is a historical book. They think it's the vibrant present. And I was like, oh yeah. I was writing in this like bulbous like Wikipedia page way, like in 1857 I was like, I was writing it and I was bored, right? And then Janice said that thing and it was like a total game changer. Like, oh, for them it's today. So what the hell would the story sound like today? And that unlocked the story, and it got a lot easier after that.
Great, thank you.
Well, Josh, thank you so much.
Yeah, I always love to nerd out and talk shop with you and your community, Barbara. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And his signed book is at Finney's in Seattle, North Seattle.
And also, I'm very easy to find online. So if you have trouble getting a copy from the store, just pop me a note and I'll get you one. Don't worry about it.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everybody for being here.
Keep fighting the good fight, all. Cheers.
Yeah.
Thanks, Josh. Great seeing you.
See you too.